in the rolling Flint Hills, where the Big Blue River meets the waters of the Kansas. Under the open sky lies the town of Boston. What started as the Boston Town Association has evolved and grown into the Manhattan we know today. Who started this community on its path of progress? What ideals shaped their vision for the future? Let's tell their story from the beginning. The Pawnee tribe lived among the valleys of the Kansas River. Eventually, the Kansa Indians pushed them further west until they finally retreated to Nebraska. Until the 1820s, the Kansa tribe controlled the area around the Kansas River and its tributaries like the Blue River and the Republican. Through treaties with the U.S. government, Kansa land shrunk to a reservation just along the Kansas River. A chief village used to be here, just east of the Blue River Bridge on K-24. They remained in the area until 1848, when they were removed to the reservation 30 miles south near Council Grove.
Some of it went down to Council Grove. Some of them went to Oklahoma. Some of them went out west farther. Some of them got away from the white man. And he put some of them in the ground. That's true.
Lone Wolf is a member of the Osage tribe who came to Manhattan to demonstrate the traditional skill of flint knapping.
This is their ancestral land, and the white men, even though they say they paid for it, they took it, and they killed the buffalo off so that the native people would starve to death, so would not be effective fighters.
By the time the settlers arrived, most of the Indians left were peaceful towards them.
Well, the first people that actually came into this area were squatters. There weren't very many of them. Until the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, they did not have any right to be in here because it's Indian territory.
The very first settler in the area wasn't exactly a squatter.
My father, Samuel D. Dyer, was the first settler on the Big Blue. He came there in the spring of 1853, employed by the government to run the ferry at Juniata. Kansas was indeed a wilderness. Our nearest neighbor were from 10 to 20 miles away, Sarah Dyer Woodard.
Dyer had his family and a few others with him to help at the ferry, an essential service on the military road to the newly established Fort Riley. Even after a bridge was built, he stayed there and operated a grocery.
In the summer of 1854, with my uncle, I started for Kansas. We came on afoot to Juniata, arriving there November 24th. S.D. Dyer from Tennessee kept the hotel, the only dwelling there. It was built of logs, 3 stories long and with 3 big fireplaces. Marsh Garrett kept the grocery store in another log building. Amos H. Powers.
Another early settlement was that of Canton. Canton was the home of Samuel D. Houston, E.M. Thurston, and 3 others.
He probably came out and started to establish a farm just below Dyerstown, or Juniata, which is up in the general area of Rocky Ford now. And it wasn't there very long, and he came down just below Bluemont Hill. And then later on, these other fellows came in, 4 other fellows from the east. All of them were college graduates, they said, and all of them were relatively young men. And they decided to establish what they called Canton Town, which was anchored more or less where the old Blue River and the Kansas River channels came together.
At this time, the rivers were not exactly in the same place they are today. This shows how the Blue and Kansas rivers are today. Before the flood of 1903 changed the landscape, the rivers ran more like this. The old channel of the Blue River can still be seen running along Tuttle Creek Boulevard. The intended site for Canton was probably where the parking lot of Town Center Mall is today. However, the only recorded dwelling was a dugout at the bottom of Bluemont Hill, probably near where this cabin stands. Another settlement along the old Kansas River channel was Pallistra, founded by George Park.
He was from Parkville, Missouri, and he had a newspaper there. And he came out here, and his idea was that he was going to establish this city, Pallistra, and he wanted to put in a newspaper out here. But he realized that if he's going to build a city, that a blacksmith shop was probably more important in the early days than the newspaper. He built the blacksmith shop and a cabin together.
Just how important was a blacksmith shop? Blacksmith and historical reenactor Joe Harris explains.
Blacksmith made everything from eyeglasses to the hinge, spoons, forks, nails, hooks, anything to do with like the plow, the chains that hooked up the mule to the wagons, the wagon wheels. Nothing got done too much without the blacksmith. Sooner or later you had to have what he had or what he could provide. They made door latches, door knobs, the chandelier that held, or the hooks that held the chandelier. He made the candle lantern holders, the fire grates, the things that they call a crane for putting your pot inside of the fireplace. He made all that. If something broke as far as that was metal, he was the one that came, you brought it to him to be fixed.
As important as a blacksmith was, George Park left, supposedly to get supplies. He didn't return for nearly a year. During his absence, there were a few changes.
Fully believing that the rule of slavery or of freedom in the nation would be settled on the prairies of Kansas, I felt impelled to throw myself into the scale on the side of freedom. Isaac Goodnow.
The New England Immigration Aid Society organized 17 groups to settle in Kansas for the purpose of voting Kansas into the Union as a free state. Most of the earlier parties settled in Douglas or Shawnee counties. The colony bound for Riley County left Boston, Massachusetts on March 13, 1855. A committee led by Isaac Goodnow was sent ahead to scout for a suitable location. They arrived at Kansas City and met with the society's agent, General Samuel C. Pomeroy.
We sat up that night till 2 o'clock, settling the question of where our company should go. With remarkable accuracy, he described the country at the junction of the Big Blue and Kansas rivers. With singular foresight, he foretold that the government bridge at Juniata would soon be washed away, and the travel would eventually go over the Blue near its mouth, and Juniata become extinct.
Pomeroy gave Goodnow a letter of introduction to a man who had moved into the area just west of Juniata, a man by the name of Reverend Charles Blood.
Blood was a congregational missionary preacher. He probably was here several months, 4 or 5 at least, before Goodnow and his party got here.
One time, Marsh Garrett was going down to Leavenworth to buy a stock of goods. He said to my father, "Hadn't I better get some whiskey? It would sell well to the teamsters." My father said, "If you see any preacher that will come and preach to us, bring him in place of whiskey." He met the Reverend Blood and brought him and Mrs. Blood back with him. Reverend Blood preached and Mrs. Blood taught school.
Dr. Parrish discovered in Blood's diary that he was already on his way here at the invitation of George Park. It was probably a happy coincidence he and Garrett ran into each other in Leavenworth. When Goodnow's party came, Reverend Blood agreed to be their guide. Bluemont Hill gave the best vantage point.
Taking position on top of an Indian mound on Saturday evening, March 25, 1855, we looked upon the most beautiful town site we ever beheld. With the old Greek philosopher, I felt like exclaiming, "Eureka! Eureka! I have found it! I have found it!"
He found it, but the territorial election was only 5 days away on March 30th. Word was sent immediately to the rest of the Boston party waiting in Kansas City. Pro-slavery ruffians from Missouri poured into the Kansas territory to cast their votes. There had been trouble of this kind before, so the governor ordered a census taken a few months earlier. More than twice the votes were cast than people counted in the census. The only Free State man elected was Samuel D. Houston from the Juniata precinct. Goodnow and his committee wasted no time establishing the town of Boston. They originally thought to claim all the land between Canton and Polystra.
If you read some of the early history, it says they combined Polystra, Canton, and Boston to make one town. That's not quite right. Actually, the people that wrote the Constitution for Boston were not only the people from the New England Immigrant Aid Society, but they invited anybody else that wanted to be part of it to join them. And Blood was one, a fellow by the name of Bishop was another, and that happened to be in here. Every one of these 5 Canton guys was part of the Boston Association. So they were both in the Canton people that were selling and the Boston people that were buying. They were on both sides. And then Park, he may have come in about a week or 10 days later.
George Park was offered 75 shares in the Boston Town Association. He took the offer.
The next development, of course, was when the Hartford got stalled down here.
The Hartford, the most fabled boat in Manhattan's history. Although there are no pictures of the Hartford, it probably looked very much like this. The Cincinnati and Kansas Land Company was formed to bring settlers out west by riverboat. They envisioned a thriving city in the heart of the continent that would be the center of trade and commerce in America. It would rival the financial might of Manhattan Island herself, hence the name Manhattan. The only trouble was, it didn't exist yet.
So old Meade, who was one of the partners, he had to beat it out here and establish a Manhattan.
Andrew Meade waited for the Hartford to arrive, but it never did. The Kansas River was low that year, and the Hartford was docked in Kansas City, waiting for the water level to rise. Once it started upriver, it grounded near Lawrence and had to wait again for the water to rise. Eventually, it passed the Blue River on June 1, 1855. The passengers on the Hartford had received invitations to stay at every town they passed on their way up the Kansas. Boston was no different. At first, the offer was turned down because none of the boat's owners were there to make the decision. 3 officers of the Cincinnati and Kansas Company were at the original Manhattan town site where Junction City is located now. There was a dispute between Fort Riley and Pawnee and other settlements that were on fort property. Concerned that their claim was in jeopardy, the officers returned to the Hartford. Boston again invited them to stay, including an offer of 320 acres and more. Weary of their long journey and the prospect of difficulties with Fort Riley, they decided to stay. But how did the name get changed to Manhattan?
Some people make quite a thing about this, that, well, we kind of had to force this on the Boston people. It just so happens that about 2 weeks before, the Boston group had voted to change the name. Well, I think in their conversations that Meade said, well, you know, we were supposed to bring our people out to Manhattan, and says we told people in Cincinnati we were going to Manhattan, and coming all up the river we were known as the Manhattan people. Well, after they explained this thing, well, can we call the town Manhattan? I think it was kind of an easy thing to do. And they wrote it right up in this agreement. The town would be called Manhattan.
And that's how Manhattan came to be. Manhattan has grown into that city that it is today, and will continue to grow into the future.
We crossed the prairies as of old as pilgrims cross the sea, to make the west as they the east, the homestead of the free. The homestead of the free, my boys, the homestead of the free. To make the west as they the east, the homestead of the free. We go to rear a wall of men on freedom's southern line, and plant beside the cotton bale the rugged northern pine. The homestead of the free, my boys, the homestead of the free. To make the west as they the east, the homestead of the free. We go to plant her common schools on distant prairie swells, and give the Sabbath of the wild the music of her bells. The homestead of the free, my boys, the homestead of the free. To make the West as say the East, the homestead of the free.